everyone, so I have made the executive decision to pick the most stereotypical week of the year to film my top 10 favourite romance novels of all time, and that is of course the week of Valentine's. So Valentine's Day is this weekend and I'm filming this video earlier in the week with the intention of uploading it before then, in case you fancy just reading some romance on Valentine's, or you just fancy reading some romance in general. I love myself a romance book. I only really got into the genre a few years ago after having been convinced it wasn't for me. But ever since I discovered the joys and all of the many different subgenres, I have completely fallen in love myself. And whether I'm single or dating or in a relationship, I've always found that there is a place for romance in my reading. It can often be quite a comforting genre, it can be quite a fun, fast-paced genre, but it can also be quite a deep and meaningful genre, and there's a lot to offer out there, and like I said, a lot of different subgenres. So I wanted to talk to you about my 10 favourite romances. I still think I have a lot of exploring to do within the wider romance genre, but I have found that I definitely gravitate towards a few subgenres like historical romance. I already loved fantasy, so of course I love a bit of fantasy romance, but I do think that this is quite a diverse list in that there is a bit of fantasy romance, a bit of historical romance, and a bit of contemporary romance, as well as a little bit of like contemporary with a dash of paranormal in there. So hopefully something for everybody, whether you're a romance fan already or just looking to jump into the genre. Without further ado, you know what to expect at this point, so let's talk about my top 10 favourite romance novels. I should also probably say that despite all these subgenres, I feel that each of these books is primarily a romance novel. So lots of books definitely have relationships and romances within them, but unless it takes up the majority of the plot, or I'd say at least 50% of the storyline, then I wouldn't necessarily categorise it as a romance novel first and foremost, and those are what these books are. So these are in no particular order, but the first novel that I've jotted down on my list is 9 Rules to Break When Romancing a Rake by Sarah MacLean, which is book 1 in the Love by Numbers series. Now this is a historical romance novel set in the 1800s. I think all but one of the historical romances that I am going to talk about in this video are set in the 1800s. It is a very popular era for romance literature and one that I have just found myself very drawn to over my reading journey. Now in this novel we follow Lady Calpurnia Hartwell, who is a woman of aristocratic birth. However, she has had sort of marriage pass her by. She's in her mid to late 20s, I believe it is, so of course effectively on the shelf. Who would want a woman in her mid to late 20s? Obviously this is very much in the era of the historical period that we are set in, quite common. However, Calpurnia has written off the idea of love. She is a curvy woman, she has always been considered quite plain, and she's also, like I said, on the older side of marriageable age in this time period. So as far as she's concerned, she is kind of written off, and many people in the town have also written her off. And although she has kind of accepted this herself, it takes overhearing a conversation between her younger sister who's about to get married and her fiance for her to really sort of feel the anger that she should towards all of these expectations and restrictions put upon her as a young woman in her time and in her place. And she decides that it doesn't matter if she has been put on the shelf, it doesn't matter if she's never going to get married, she's still going to enjoy her life, and she is going to make a list of things that she wants to do, daring things that women in society are not supposed to do, and she is going to just go out there and do them, because also who cares about her reputation when she's not intending on getting married anyway. The level of drama on this list goes all the way from smoking a cheroot cigar to spending the evening in a gentleman's club and even sharing her first kiss with a roguish gentleman. Now, of course, this roguish gentleman gets pulled in to Calpurnia's adventure and ends up having to assist her in ticking off everything in her list. But obviously, they fall in love. It's a historical romance novel. The endings of every single one of these books are incredibly predictable, and that is one of my favourite things about them. But aside from the romance, I just kind of love our protagonist. I love how she finds this new lease of life, how she decides to take things into her own hands, decides to go on adventures and do the things that she wants to try and do, whether they are tiny little things or big, grand, out of order things. I love that. I love that about her. I love that she decides to reject all of these expectations and restrictions that are placed upon her. Now, sometimes when you read historical romance, you're just going to have to accept that maybe these things are pushing it a little bit in terms of realism, but I like that they bring a bit of modern day feminist sensibility to these periods and these women, because just because women were living in the 1800s didn't mean that they couldn't have the same desires as modern day women, it just meant it was harder for them. And I like that relationship between modern and old that you get in 19th century romance, and this for me was just an excellent example of those features. A really lovable protagonist, a fun, feisty romance, and a bit of an adventure with a few laughs in between. There is one author above all else, however, that introduced me to and cemented my love of the historical romance genre, and that is of course Tessa Dare. I've mentioned her quite a few times on this channel in the past, and she's the romance writer I've read the greatest number of romance novels by. But the one I'm going to mention in this video, and trust me, it was very, very difficult. In fact, I was really torn between this book and the Duchess deal, but I'm just going to go for this one because I love the background premise of it. Not to mention it was the series I started with, and that's A Night to Surrender, book one in the Spindle Cove series. Now, the reason I mentioned really enjoying the sort of backdrop to this series is because Spindle Cove is a seaside town slash resort in the 19th century where women go who are not necessarily accepted by society. They are potentially wallflowers who struggle to talk to men at balls, so don't have much hope of finding a husband, or they have strange proclivities, they're considered eccentric, or even they've been involved in illicit affairs that have pushed them out of town. And all of these women congregate and gather here at Spindle Cove. This wonderful safe haven is created for them by a woman, a wealthy aristocratic woman who's in residence there. And this very same aristocratic woman, Susanna, is one half of our romance in the novel. So disturbing their idyllic, peaceful life in Spindle Cove is a platoon of soldiers who have turned up there, including the new Earl of Rycliffe, Victor Bramwell. He's brash, he's terrace, he is many things that 19th century male protagonists often are, but he's also lovable and comes with his own story. Now, of course, he and Susanna hit it off. At first they absolutely hate each other, but that eventually develops into what we will describe as lust and eventually love, and you have yourself a really fun-filled romance against this fantastic backdrop full of fantastic feisty female characters from all different walks of life. Later on in the series we follow an eccentric geologist, we follow a music teacher, we follow a maid, and lots of different women, like I mentioned, which is really nice as well because they're not all aristocratic, which is something that I find is far more common in 19th century romance, is to follow aristocratic characters, and it is nice to see a little bit of class diversity, although I would still say I struggle to find that. But all in all, Spindle Cove is just a fantastic series. Just in case you're really not into the whole 19th century romance setting, I'll shake things up briefly and talk about what is possibly my favourite romance novel of all time. And that is difficult to say because I love all of the books in this video, but there is something so special about this book, and it's the only one out of these that I've actually read more than once. That is Radiance by Grace Draven. So this is a fantasy romance, but for me the fantasy element, despite being a massive fantasy fan, is second fiddle. Like, it isn't that important or relevant. It is about the relationship between the two main characters. The fantasy setting is a backdrop, 100%. This to me is a romance novel, but it is a romance novel that I adore, and I feel the fantasy element adds a layer of world building and intricacy to it that I really appreciate, even if it's not the central genre for me. So this book follows a human woman named Ildiko and a Kai man named Brishan. So both characters are from entirely different species. One humans, like I mentioned, the other Kai, which is a magical race in this world that Grace Draven has created, and they have been set up as part of an arranged marriage between their two people to create an alliance. They have both gone into this marriage very willingly. They accepted a long time ago that as nobles of their people that they would be part of an arranged marriage, not a love match, and they are just hoping beyond hope to be able to get on with their partner. And that is what makes this book so beautiful to me, because from the very beginning both of these people go into it with the same mindset and find that they are similar kinds of people, that they both want the same things, and even if they are not attracted to each other or not interested in having a sexual relationship with one another, they are so willing willing to build a partnership and a friendship with one another. They are both incredibly respectful of one another, and that friendship is what slowly builds to a romantic relationship and what turns from respect and friendship to romantic love, and I love that. I think it's so beautifully done. It is the most respectful, genuine, heartfelt relationship I've ever read in a romance novel, and one of the probably few relationships that I would genuinely describe as a role model for relationships and romantic relationships. Plus, like I mentioned, there's some added fun fantasy, world building and drama in there. It's just not the crux of the story, but it adds a little something something, and I do enjoy myself a fantasy novel, and Grace Draven always just writes the most fun, fully rounded, witty characters. In fact, I'd like to give an honourable mention at this point to Entreat Me by Grace Draven, which is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, but I don't want to feature more than one book by an author in this video. I just do want to mention though that I do love that book and it's an amazing romance. Sticking on the fantasy theme, we'll go into, shall we? I will next mention Nama's Kiss by Jacqueline Carey, and this book I really wanted to include in this video, although it's been quite a few years since I read it, and I would love to reread it because it is such a complex story with so much world building, so many characters that I really feel like I would adore returning to it. But it is a beautiful, beautiful high fantasy novel, so beautifully written, very, very complex world, gorgeous character building. We follow this main character named Moirin who grows so much as the book progresses, and she has grown up her whole life quite rurally in the forests with her mother, never having known her father. But when she reaches a certain age, she decides she wants to go off into the world and learn more about that side of her heritage. Her father was a priest of Nama, who is a goddess in this world, a goddess of like sex and sexuality, and she wants to go, like I said, and learn more about that side of herself, and she meets so many different people along the way. There's like drama, danger, magic, and love in so many forms, temporary love and long-term love, and that is what I love so much about this book, because almost every romance novel I've ever read beside this book is about one central romance, and this book is not. This book is about Moirin's many romances. She meets lots of different people, men and women in her life who she shares love and romance with. They are just not all for, in some instances her romances end well, in other instances there is tension, and it is just all about that journey of self-discovery, and I really, really love that, because many of us will have more than one romance and possibly more than one love in our life, and I think it's really nice to see that in a book, and each relationship given is due, and each relationship given its respect and shown how it develops her character, and I really, really love that about this book. It is also, like I said, just this beautiful fantasy world, and I really, really need to continue on with the series, but can say for certainty that book one is still an absolute favourite for me. I also loved reading a book about a character who, although isn't labelled, I can identify with as a bisexual woman who has relationships with men and women, which again, very rare to see in like romance novels, because you just don't often see romance stories about more than one love with the same person. So yes, I really, really enjoyed that book. Now I have to say I have read a lot more romance literature about heterosexual couples, but I do have a couple of female romances on my list, so I wanted to mention them now, and the first one is Proper English by KJ Charles. So this is another historical romance, but it's also a bit of a cosy mystery. So this is set in the early 1900s, and it's very reminiscent of an Agatha Christie novel in plot. Like I said, there is a sort of cozy mystery. It's not a thriller, but it's about a group of friends in the early 1900s who get together for a sort of shooting party at this big manor house, and there are lots and lots of secrets. Everybody has a secret, and there is potential danger associated with some of those secrets, and it just sort of escalates as the book goes on. Obviously I don't want to spoil anything or give away what the mysteries or drama are, but just trust me, if you like a mystery, it has that really nice added element to the storyline. Amidst this, however, we follow our two female protagonists who end up starting a romantic relationship. Now, as this is the early 1900s, Patricia and Fenella do not necessarily have the freedom, or have not had the freedom in their life to express their sexualities, but they are immediately drawn to one another, and in each other they find a safe haven and a space to be themselves and express themselves and support one another, and it's beautiful. Their relationship is adorable and just lovely, and I really, really enjoyed reading about it. I read so few historical romances about female couples. I find it so much harder to find them than I do a male or male-female couples. So this book just gave me something that I'd always wanted and struggled to find, and it was a really fun romp along the way. My second romance between two women, however, is The Queen of efariah by Effie Calvin. It's a fantasy novel, in this case one where I feel like the fantasy plot is a little bit more central and important than say in Radiance. It's about two young women who are part of an arranged marriage between their two kingdoms, and this is first off one of my favourite things about this book. In this world there is no homophobia, and it is just such a pleasure to read a world where there is no homophobia, no transphobia, where people can express their sexuality and their gender identity however they want, and it is beautiful. And you need that in literature. You need these beautiful spaces where you can imagine a world like that, because it's not yet the world we live in, and I'm so grateful to Effie Calvin for creating a world like that. And I have never in my life read a book where two kingdoms have planned an alliance through daughters, through two women getting married, and that is just stunning. I love that initial concept. Now, of course, there's a little bit of tension between them at first because they are actually quite different people, so figuring out whether they can and should work together as a couple is a little bit of a rocky journey, but they are willing to sort of explore that and talk about that and get to know one another and see if that is a possibility. The reason that the alliance between their kingdom is necessary is because there are dragons attacking one of our kingdoms, and our other kingdom has the ability and the magic to push those dragons back. Now, you know I don't love books with evil dragons, so just without spoilers, let me say, trust me, it is more complex a situation than it at first seems, and I think it's brilliant and brilliantly done, and I love it, and I love seeing how it all unfolds. Plus, I also just love seeing how the relationship develops between our two protagonists. They both grow as people throughout the book, and they help one another grow as people, and they're very open from the beginning that maybe this isn't going to be the right decision for them, maybe they shouldn't get married, but they are willing to see if they can find something in one another, and that leads them to establish this wonderful partnership and this wonderful team, and I love them for it. It's actually snowing outside right now, which I'm going to use as an opportunity to segue into my next book because it's set during Christmas time, which we've now passed, but it looks quite Christmassy outside. And that is Black Witch Magic by Mila Nix. Now, this is one of the contemporary romances on my list. It's set in the modern day. However, it is a contemporary romance with a dash, or should I say a sort of lump of paranormal dropped on there, as the title might imply. So we follow two different characters. We have our female protagonist, Celine, who is a moon witch living in a small United States town which she has never been able to leave because of a curse placed on her family a couple of generations ago. And then we follow Aidan, who is a paranormal investigator for a web-based docu-series, and he and his friend go around haunted buildings and legends and investigate whether they are true or not. Aidan is a skeptic, he doesn't believe in that kind of stuff, whereas his friend Eddie is super into it and convinced that it's all real. Now, what could make a better duo than a skeptical paranormal investigator and a witch? I mean, I don't know. You tell me, because I can't think of one. And I love their witty banter and the fact that they are, in part, so different but actually so similar. They're both bookish and introverted and sarcastic and kind, and they make such a gorgeous duo. They are such a cute couple, and they end up being dragged into solving a mystery currently going on in the town in which Celine lives. So this book has it all. It has magic, it has romance, and it has mystery. What more could you want? Plus, one of the things I really appreciated about this book, and I will say it's not a very sex heavy book, but there are a couple of sex scenes in there, and in the first instance, in the first sexual encounter between our two love interests, it doesn't all go perfectly. It is not this mind-blowing, incredible experience that it often is in first times in romance literature. It's a little bit awkward and they come out of it feeling a little bit embarrassed, but thankfully they're able to work through it, and I thought that that was really, really nice representation to see. On the topic of contemporary romance, I next want to mention Sophia Khan is Not Obliged by Aisha Malik. So this book is actually inspired by Bridget Jones and Pride and Prejudice. I say both because Bridget Jones, as you probably know, is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, but this book isn't just a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, it's also very clearly drawing on certain themes from Bridget Jones. In particular, the fact that our protagonist, Sophia Khan, works in publishing in London. And I absolutely loved that first and foremost. When I read this book, I was actually working in publishing in London, I think, so it was just this nice parallel. And Sophia Khan is a Muslim young woman, like I said, living in London, working in publishing, who ends up getting roped into writing a Muslim dating book by the publishing house she works for. And having very recently broken up with her fiance, Sophia Khan is quite new to the dating scene. And it is thus her experience both of dating and trying to write this book at the same time. Plus there's this slightly irksome, slightly grumpy, yet very handsome neighbour man who may come into the story in large part, but I will say no more. And I really enjoyed this book. It was actually probably one of the first romance novels I ever read, and I really enjoyed that interaction between a classic like Jane Austen as well as a more modern classic, if you want to call it, like Bridget Jones, but bringing in that element of what it is like to be a Muslim woman living in contemporary London, and it does touch on that. So these were all really nice things that gelled well together for me as a reader, plus I really loved Sophia Khan as a character, so this was a big hit for me. Apologies if the angle or lighting has changed slightly, but I'm having to re-record this very small section and I just didn't want this book not to be included, so here we are. And that is The Lady's Deception by Susanna Craig. So Susanna Craig is a historical romance writer that I discovered last year in 2020, and for me is so reminiscent of Tessa Dare in the way she makes me feel as a reader. She is definitely her own writer and she writes her own unique storylines and has her own way of telling them, but there is something in the way her book made me feel that very much reminded me of Tessa Dare. I think it's probably because of her combination of intriguing characters, fun plot, and also humour. I love a little bit of humour in my historical romances. I think all of my favourite historical romances have a little bit of humour in there. And although in this instance it is in no way a distracting element from the rest of the book, it's just a really nice addition. And I also love the characters and their relationship. This is about a young woman who has had to flee her brother, who is trying to force her to marry a man that she has no interest in, that seems like an absolute brute, not somebody you'd want to be married to, and she has no means of her own until her next birthday, but it's still a few months away, so she's decided to seek out a lawyer in order to help her be emancipated from her brother and potentially get her money earlier, or at least not be forced into marriage. And this all takes place in Ireland, so she finds herself in the city encountering a lawyer who is actually a little bit drunk when he meets her and doesn't realise that she's not the nanny he hired for his two younger sisters. So in order to hide from her brother, she decides to just go along with this case of mistaken identity and be the nanny to these two little kids until she's old enough to be free of her brother's whims. And as much as it would be slightly distressing in reality, there's always something a little bit fun when it comes to mistaken identities and slightly ludicrous scenarios in historical romances, and it works really well here. I love both female and male love interests. They click really well. They're different enough but gel well enough that it just makes a great couple. Plus I find their relationship very respectful and low on the drama. Of course there are secrets and mistakes and rows and possible instances of them having to be separated, as there is in all historical romance, but at the end of the day I always feel their communication and honesty comes through and really is the foundation of that relationship, and is so nice to read as a reader, because too often there can be these real moments of exacerbated drama between the two love interests that I feel is unnecessary as a reader and is caused by the characters themselves rather than outside forces. Whereas in this instance I always feel like the drama between them is the cause of outside forces, and they're a team throughout it, and I really appreciate that. Then last but not least, I thought I'd polish things off with another historical romance, because as we've established that is clearly Jane's favourite subgenre of romance. And this one is The Madness of Lord Ian Mackenzie by Jennifer Ashley, which is book one in the Mackenzie and McBride's series. And yes, if you cannot tell by those Mac-Mix surnames, this is a Highlander romance, or at least it is a romance novel featuring a Scottish love interest. Now this was a book I read as part of an experiment earlier in 2020. Gosh, I was going to say earlier this year, but it was in 2020, which was over a year ago now. which I did this video, which was An Actual Scot Reads Highland Romances. I love historical romance, but up until then I'd never read a Highlander romance, which is a historical romance with a Scottish love interest, and that's like its whole own subgenre. I was a little bit nervous going into those because I am Scottish and I wasn't sure how I would deal with stereotyping, etc. But I came out of that video pleasantly surprised. There were some books I didn't like, but it really wasn't to do with the fact that they had Scottish characters, and there were some that I loved, including this one. I adored this book, and I'm so glad I filmed that video because otherwise I might never have read it. And this is all about our protagonist Beth and our love interest Ian. So Beth is a widow, and that is one of the points for this novel. I love that Beth is not a woman new to marriage, new to romance, or new to sex. She has had a previous love in a previous relationship which she was very happy in, and she is at a new point in her life deciding whether she wants to remarry and enter Ian, who has never been married before and is often shunned by society because he is autistic. Now, the word autistic is never used in the book because I don't think the word autistic existed in the 19th century. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but the author has been very clear since the book's release that Ian is autistic, and this hasn't always made life the easiest for him. But he and Beth just click. There is this spark there, and it lights a flame and it's beautiful and exciting and wonderful, and I love their relationship. Plus, there is a bit of a murder mystery in this book, which is a really fun addition. I mean, quite a dark addition, but fun nevertheless. There is a series of murders in this novel, and Ian is actually one of the suspects, although perhaps not fairly. And it is all about both that crime, what's going on, the police detective who's all up in everyone's business, and Beth's newfound romance. Now, 5 years later, because I think that's how long I've been filming this video, I have come to the end of my top 10. Those were my top 10 romance novels that I have thus far read. I'm sure there are many more great romance novels in my future. In fact, I would love your recommendations. If you have romance novels that you love and would like to recommend to me, please do leave them in the comments down below. And aside from that, I hope you're all doing well, and remember that there are so many more relationships than just romantic ones that are important in our lives. So take care of yourself and the people you love, and until next time, happy reading. I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone!